Hello, and welcome to episode 61 of the Bible Q&A with Pastor Stephen. My name is Stephen Pace, and I'm the senior pastor at Decatur Bible Church in Decatur, Michigan. On this podcast, I attempt to answer Bible-related questions in both a clear but also a thorough manner. If you would like to have a Bible-related question considered for a future episode, you can email me your question to pastorstevendbc@gmail.com. Again, that's pastorstevendbc@gmail.com. And then I will consider for a future episode your Bible question. Now, on this episode, this is of course episode 61, I'm going to look at something that I started in episode 60. So if you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to listen to that as well. And for all practical purposes, what I'm looking at is the idea of Jesus as the creator in relation to his creation. In episode 60, I looked at a question that was posed to me, which was essentially, where in the Bible does it speak or give the verses to the fact of Jesus being the creator? So we looked at that, as well as sort of the so what does it mean then if Jesus is involved and is the creator? So I would encourage you to look at that as well. So that's episode 60. Now on this episode, what we're going to look at is a similar topic, but what we're going to look at is what evidence do we have that Jesus has power over his creation. In other words, it would be a way of saying if Jesus really is the creator, we should be able to see evidence of his control over creation. If you think about it in terms of today, if you and I go fishing out in the ocean, or there's a weather-related situation coming, strong storms, we can't control those. We can protect ourselves against them, but we don't have control over them. And so in this episode, what we're going to look at is several miracles or attesting signs that are given in the four Gospels. And these are specific to miracles related to Jesus as having power over his creation. Because again, in episode 60, we saw where Jesus clearly is seen as being the creator, and the application of the so what does that mean? But today we're going to look at what evidence then do we actually have, because we should see that in the four Gospels. And of course, indeed, we do. So grab your Bibles and let's start off in John chapter 2. John chapter 2, and we're going to look at this first miracle. So John chapter 2, and we'll look at verses 1 through 10 in a summary form. So you're probably familiar with this miracle. This is the first in John's Gospel of 7 miracles, sometimes referred to as attesting signs. You'll probably notice that each of these are listed as signs. If you see, for example, in John 2 verse 10, after the miracle at Cana occurs, notice verse 11, the beginning of his signs. So signs was the term, sort of the synonym that John used, versus the miracle term that we would see, for instance, in the synoptics. But in any case, this is the first of 7 signs, and the point behind them is to reveal who Jesus was. We actually see this as the purpose statement. It's in John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. And so these signs that John selects, they're not all of the miracles of Jesus, but they are to serve the purpose of showing him to be the Son of God, God incarnate, the very thing he describes in John chapter 1. Now, one of the things that's curious about this one, and I'm going to stick to just the aspect of the sign so we can get through all the ones on this episode. But there's a lot to this particular sign. But this is a miracle at Cana. This is early in Jesus' ministry, and probably well known, oddly enough, for the fact that Jesus and his disciples, they were invited to a wedding They attend the wedding. The mother of Jesus was there, and this is the famous part of the miracle. Sometimes that gets lost. The miracle gets lost sometimes in this, where they run out of wine, and Jesus calls his mother, "Woman, my hour has not yet come." Of course, that's not a derogatory. If I was teaching on it, I would explain it a little bit more. It wasn't derogatory, as we might tend to read it. But Jesus' point in verse 4 of John 2 was to say that his hour had not come. Jesus, in other words, had a certain specific purpose for his hour, which John reveals later as the crucifixion and such. But again, for our purposes, in terms of the miracle and showing his power over the natural elements of creation, you can see it very clearly in this miracle. So, for example, in verse 6, there were 6 stone water pots, and they contained, if you notice, they're 20 to 30 gallons, so these are very large water pots. And Jesus tells them to fill them up. But notice in particular verse 7 how it ends. So they filled them up to the brim. The point there is they were completely filled and nothing else was in them. So imagine a container that was filled to the very brink of it, the top of it, the rim, and it was filled completely with water. The idea is there's nothing else that can be added to it. And from there, you go on with the miracle, and Jesus says to the waiter there to go ahead and draw water out, and he begins to draw water out. And the water was wine, and it was the best wine. And there's a lot of symbolism and lessons behind that. But in regards to Jesus' power over creation, which is what we're looking at, you'll notice a few things, which is that Jesus doesn't speed up or have any delays in the time process. In other words, in order to make wine, there's a time and period involved. And Jesus doesn't do that. He just simply speaks and it is. He creates something and he has control over the natural elements. It takes time to ferment and to make wine, and there was no time involved. Jesus just willed it forth and it was. He spoke it forth and it was. And you can see back in John chapter 1 and verse 3, all things came into being through him. The him is Jesus. And apart from Jesus, nothing came into being that came into be. And so the idea there with the miracle at Cana of Galilee, this is the first sign or miracle. It simply deals with the natural elements of creation, and Jesus has power over them. He's able to take water and simply speak it or will it forth to be changed completely into wine. And of course, the best was saved now, of course, not to last, but first. And it was a sign, in verse 11, to his disciples. And you'll notice the disciples believe, and as the gospel goes on, they believe a little bit more. The idea there is they grow in their faith and in their understanding of Jesus, just like we should. So the first miracle there, water into wine, gives us a glimpse of Jesus' power over the natural elements of creation. The next one we're going to look at is in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. So let's turn to Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. And again, these miracles in this one, I'm sure, probably familiar with. And it's, again, Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. And when we look at this one, this is the miraculous fishing day, as I like to think of it. Jesus has begun his ministry. He calls those disciples in the early days, and he is there. And Peter, of course, they've been fishing and they haven't been able to catch anything. If you look, for instance, in Luke chapter 5, verse 5, Simon there, of course, Peter says, "Master, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing, but I will do as you say and let down the nets." And so Peter there, Simon that is, goes forward and does what would seem strange. Catching fish at that time would have been done at its best or peak time at night, and this was clearly during the day, but Simon was going to have to be obedient to what Jesus said, regardless of whether it made sense. Many ways, the beginning process of something that would probably occur throughout his life. as he sought to serve the Lord. But here we see where Jesus, of course, tells them to go out. They go out and they catch, verse 6, this massive amount, so much that the nets begin to break. And the boat, verse 7, seems to almost be completely filled. But one of the things to think about with this is that, again, there's a lot of different variations to these, meaning there's a lot of elements and principles to these miracles. But with this miraculous fish catch, this fishing day, Jesus shows power over his creation, because he has power over not simply the elements, but the creatures in the sea. Imagine being able to will forth and desire that those massive amount of fish come into the nets in such an abundance that they really can't even sustain them in the nets or the boat. So there, the miracle there, Jesus having the ability to completely control the elements of the sea, which we're going to look at later again. So in these first two, simply what you need to see is that Jesus' power over both the natural elements as well as the creatures of the sea. Remember Genesis 1, and keep in mind what we looked at last time in episode 60. And so essentially, since God is the one who created all things, and he created all of the fish and the birds, and then as well as these natural intricate elements related to the wine and the water, Jesus alone is the one who's able to control them. So if God created something, he has the power and control over them. And we see that revealed in the four Gospels as well. Now, as we move on to this next one, this will be the third example of a few that we'll look at in this episode. I want you to turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, and we're going to look at another familiar passage, which is again Mark 4, but we'll look at verses 35 through 41. And here we're going to see, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the two sides to this, which is we'll continue to see Jesus's creation power over the natural world, but we're going to look at this a little bit, I would call theologically, but also sort of on a personal or devotional side, which is a good principle. When we look at these, we can look too much one way or the other, and there's a lot to these, of course, as anyone who studies these miracles will quickly find out. But in Mark 4, 35 through 41, what you're going to see is this continued theme, and this would be sort of the theological side of it, where Jesus as the creator controls his creation in a very strong, if you want to say physical way. Notice verse 35 of Mark 4. On that day, when evening came, he said to them, "Let us go to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. So Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to it, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down and became perfectly calm. But notice verse 41. So he's asked them, "Why are you afraid?" I mean, in a sense, why would you not have faith in me? I am the great I am. I'm the one who created everything. I control everything. It's not as though we're going to go out here and perish in the ocean, or in this case, the Sea of Galilee. But notice verse 41, they became very much afraid and said to one another, and this is really the main point of the miracle. Notice the conclusion that they're beginning to draw about Jesus' person. They, the disciples, become very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Verse 41 is the point of the miracle. And the main thing is that they're beginning to realize, it's almost somewhat probably rhetorical at this point, they must begin to reckon in their mind that only God can control the wind and the sea. This was heavy Jewish theology. Only God could do that. And if Jesus is able to do this, the natural conclusion is this is God incarnate, the Son of God. And so there's the theological side of it that shows Jesus is just that. He's the one who's able to control it because he's God in the flesh. Now, on sort of the personal, devotional side, again, who is this? It's important to understand that Jesus controls and is in control of all events. He knows all the things that go on in our lives. I like to think of this miracle in a couple of ways. One of is in verse 41, in a sense, who is this? So on the one hand, you have Jesus as the Son of God, the Creator, the theological side. And I say this, we need to be careful with this miracle because it isn't just that Jesus is in the boat. I hear that sometimes, and yes, that's true, but if Jesus is just a man, he couldn't really do much good to save them. What verse 41 is saying, the reason why he's in the boat and why it's so significant is because he is God in the flesh and he is in control and is not going to let them perish. And so it's one of the main things to see. Now, if you also notice when Jesus speaks to his creation in verse 39, he tells it to hush. In Greek, it means to silence or to put a muzzle on something. And there was no time involved. It just immediately stopped. And so Jesus speaks and creation stops. And this is a really important one, again, for several reasons, but Jesus is able to immediately make something stop. I mean, waves don't just stop. Whenever there's a storm that doesn't stop, it takes a period of time, but Jesus just speaks and it silences itself. Let me give you some Old Testament verses that speak of God controlling nature, and then we'll move on to the two final ones. Job chapter 9 and verse 8. Psalm 65 verse 7, Psalm 89 verse 9, and then Psalm 107 verses 28 through 30. And so Jesus is not subject to his creation, but rather creation is in subjection to him. And so we see that very clearly in many of these miracles, in particular the one there in Mark 4. Now, as we've looked at so far some evidence of Jesus being visibly seen as having power over his creation, in other words, we have the evidence of it. John chapter 2, of course, the water into wine, no time lapse involved, the natural elements. The miraculous catch in Luke 5, of course, over the creatures of the sea. Jesus has power over the natural world, very evidently seen in Mark 4, over the storms in the sea and stopping the sea. But we're going to look at two other ones, and both of these are in John chapter 6, and they occur one subsequent to the other, and good evidence as well here. John chapter 6 verses 1 through 14, very familiar passage. The feeding of the 5,000, you have this as well in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we'll use John because, of course, John's purpose is to show Jesus in his deity. And picking up here, we'll see in John 6, we see where, of course, Jesus has the need to feed the multitudes. Jesus tests the disciples, and again, these are very rich miracles, have a lot of principles in them, but for our purposes, Jesus has, many of us know, the little boy comes up to him, verse 9 of John 6, there's 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, not much, but with Jesus, he is able to do far more abundantly than they could ever imagine. And so in verse 11, Jesus takes them, he gives thanks, them meaning the loaves and the fish, and he gives thanks, traditional, probably Jewish thanks to God for the provisions, because only God is the one who ultimately provides. And then Jesus just simply begins to fill these baskets. He's duplicating. This is typically seen as multiplication. So he's creating more than enough, but he's multiplying something. He's taking the element of the fish and the what would probably be like a biscuit, and he's just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying these things. And so someone would have to have complete control over that which is his creation, in order to multiply something to this extent. And so the feeding of the 5,000 has a lot of practical elements to it, but don't miss that this one shows Jesus' lordship over creation. It shows his ability to multiply that which isn't there. And he's able to create something, and just a marvelous miracle. And it's so rich in the fact that in verse 13 that there was even leftovers. And again, it causes one to say, who indeed is this? Is this the prophet who is to come? Verse 14. But then we're going to finish with chapter 6, verses 15 through 21. If there was ever one to show, this and the one in Mark shows that Jesus clearly has complete control sovereignly over that which he created. Probably this one would eclipse any of the other ones, but in any event, in verses 15 through 21, we clearly see, and we know in Old Testament theology, that God alone is seen as ruling over the creation, the sea. We've already seen Jesus exhibit that with the miraculous catch, the calming of the sea. But if you looked at, and you do later, Job 9:8, it asks who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples and walks on the waves of the sea. And of course, only God can do that. So Jesus in John chapter 6, verses 15 through 21. So the disciples go and they proceed to cross the sea to Capernaum. You see that in verse 17, and it's very clear in verse 17 that Jesus was not with them. And then the storms rage, and then all of a sudden they see Jesus walking on the water. They see Jesus walking and treading on the creation. And this is just an amazing miracle that he is able to do. In particular, notice how far out they are, 3 to 4 miles of rowing. So they've been out there for a substantial period of time. They're fearful, and then Jesus simply walks up to them and says, "Don't be afraid, it is I." And Jesus has the power to walk on that creation that he created. Now I want us to turn before we finish and give you an example of what they would have perhaps thought of maybe at a later time, if not then. And it's in Psalm 107, and with this we'll finish this episode. But Psalm 107 and verses 23 through 30, I want you to read that sometime, but in particular let's look at verses 28 through 30 for this episode. So that's Psalm 107. I'd encourage you to read 23 through 30, but for time's sake, we're going to read in verse 28 through 30. And it talks about in the preceding verses the raging of the storms, the raging of the waves. And then verse 28, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. He caused the storm to be still, so that the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they were quiet, so he guided them to their desired haven. Jesus alone has the power over creation. He's seen as the creator over the elements, whether they are the natural elements, the elements of the sea, the animals, the creatures. He's able to multiply creation, the feeding of the 5,000. And then not only can he calm the sea and make it stop in immediacy, but he can also walk on his creation, something only God can do. I'll close with this. Warren Wiersbe once wrote regarding all of these miracles, but in particular Jesus coming amidst the storms and the raging of the sea. Wiersbe writes, when the hour seems the darkest, Jesus will come to us and we will reach the shore. In other words, we're never alone. He's always there, and he'll come in the right time and help us in our need. Well, I hope this episode and the previous episode have given you a general idea that Jesus is in fact the creator. He is the one who was involved in creation. In episode 60 we looked at that. We saw why that was important. But we've also seen here in this episode some examples some 5 examples of where Jesus shows that he really is the creator. We have evidence of it. Well, thank you for taking time to listen to this episode. Until next time, God bless.